Kristen, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you as our first guest, especially as you've got a new book to read to us. It always comes back. You and I started to talk about this reading way back last year, anticipating its publication, the book's publication. But I guess, as with many things during the COVID pandemic, 2021, it got in the way. And although it feels like a long time to me, I reckon it probably feels like a very long time for you to have to have waited.
Well, since we've been in the pandemic, time is it's just an odd thing. It's like, you think about stuff that you think happened last year and it actually happened 2 or 3 years ago now because there was a whole pandemic in between. So yeah, what is time?
I guess we're all beginning to think a bit like that. But I mean, given that you won the award for this book in 2020 from Snapshot Press, I'm guessing you started thinking about it long before you sent it into Snapshot.
Yes, although probably not as long as you would think. I think I pulled it together pretty close to the deadline, if I'm remembering right.
Yeah, so it didn't it was done specifically, you put it together specifically for Snapshot, not just.
I did, yes.
You said you went down to the wire with it, but you must have had some thoughts about putting the collection together. How did you go about doing that? Because this isn't the first collection you put together, so I guess you've got some experience.
It's my first haiku collection that I've put together. But yeah, I a friend of mine had had his chapbook published as an e-chapbook with Snapshot Press, and I really loved the way it came out. And I thought, oh, I could do that. I'll just pull some stuff together, and I've got time to submit. So that's what was the spark. And then I just started thinking, what I wanted to put together a small collection that sort of said Maine. I was thinking, I want to just have the atmosphere of Maine in this collection. So it was sort of an intuitive pulling from poems that had been, recently published or that I'd written fairly recently that I knew I liked and that felt intuitively like they went together and that all together spoke of Maine. And that's what I put together. And honestly, after I sent it off, sorry, the cat's in the way. I'd kind of forgotten what I had submitted. I mean, I just sort of sent it off and then it just sort of went out of my brain. And then a few months later in October, that was July or late June. And then in October, when I heard from John Barlow that I was one of the co-winners of the award, I'm like, wow, what did I send him? And I had to go back and look. And then ultimately, what ends up in the published chapbook, about half of those got changed, got switched out when John really started to do a deep dive into the chapbook and how he wanted to set it up. And he actually went into my blog and looked at the last couple of years of daily blog posts and pulled poems from my blog and put those in and kind of rearranged them seasonally and made it a new little thing, but it still had the atmosphere of Maine for me. So it worked. I thought it worked well.
Well, that's interesting. So did you have to send, because there's 30 poems in it, if I remember rightly. Is that right? 30?
I think 24, I think.
24, okay.
Yeah.
So did you have to submit 24? Did you have to submit? Okay. So
Yeah.
you've submitted these 24 poems. And then some of them have been kicked out and replaced by other poems. So I guess what I'm getting at is the end result is not the one you sent. How did you negotiate your feelings about that, the changes?
Well, as I said, I didn't really remember what I had sent in the first place because I had put it together fairly intuitively and fairly quickly. I don't like to overthink these things. I wasn't wedded to whatever I had come up with. And I have read several books that John has edited and thought they were brilliant. So I really just trusted his vision for it. he explained in some detail sort of what's going through his head when he pulls a book together. And it just made a lot of sense to me, and it jibed sort of with the way I pull things together. And I just had faith that he would make it good, and it's all my work. And I'm not one of those people that's like, this has to be my way and this was my pure artistic vision and don't change it. So I'm pretty flexible that way.
We've nattered a little bit now, and I want to come back and talk to you a little bit more when you've done your reading. But I should first of all say a big thank you to everyone who commented on the book and sent us comments and questions, because we'll do some of those. We can't go to all of them because of the time we've got, but I hope we cover as much as we can.
All right, I am ready. And before I start, I too want to add my thanks to yours, to all the readers who send me and Patricia comments on the poems, who took the time to read the poems and then sent really thoughtful, wonderful comments. And I really appreciated it. And it touched me. Thank you. It always comes back. All day long, back and forth in the fog, the same crows. All day long, back and forth in the fog, the same crows. My long sweater, the color of forsythia, winter rain. My long sweater, the color of forsythia, winter rain. Sap moon, stepping in moose tracks to stay on the trail. Sap moon, stepping in moose tracks to stay on the trail. Departing ferry, tossed flowers drift back to shore. Departing ferry, tossed flowers drift back to shore. Morning heat, yellow daylilies spill down the hillside. Morning heat, yellow daylilies spill down the hillside. Ripe plums picked under a half moon. I saved you some. Ripe plums picked under a half moon. I saved you some. Longest day. I watch the tide come all the way in. Longest day. I watch the tide come all the way in. Glacial erratic, of all the places we could be. Glacial erratic, of all the places we could be. March wind, a blue tarp flaps loose on the woodpile. March wind, a blue tarp flaps loose on the woodpile. North Star, it always comes back to this. North Star, it always comes back to this.
Thanks, Kristen. I'd love to have heard you read the whole book,
Thank
but I
you.
have more questions for you. Thoughts. And the first one I'd like to take you back to is all day long, back and forth in the fog, the same crows. And this one had, as you said, quite a few comments. So I want
People
to
like crows.
they do, don't they? I know you do.
Yep.
So I picked out, I couldn't pick out what everyone said, but I picked out a couple. And Debbie says of this poem that she felt it was a poem that should be read aloud. And as you know, I think all poems should be read aloud because I have a podcast after all.
Absolutely.
So. But my question to you is, when you're putting them together, do you think of the sounds? Do you think of how they're going to sound out loud?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I read everything. I mean, not always out loud, but I do read everything over and over and over. When I'm drafting a poem, every single change, I read it and read it and read it, because it has to sound right as you're reading it. what right is, that's a whole book
Oh
in
yeah.
itself. But yeah, definitely. And also, because I'm a big fan of euphony, as I know Brad Bennett has talked about on this podcast, and he has an essay in the current issue of Modern Haiku, reiterating his thoughts on euphony. Um, I think euphony has a place in haiku, and part of picking up on that is reading it out loud to yourself and
Yeah.
trying to figure out which words just sound better.
Yes. I'm going to want to talk to you about sound with another of the poems later, about words rather, later. But picking up this idea of sound and rhythm, Laurie Richard also says of this poem that the placement of your words evokes the most sad and lovely day, watching the tide come in slowly. And I find that many of your poems have got this gentle rhythm to them. And from what you've said, well, you've said you listen to the sound and you listen to the rhythm, but do you set out with a rhythm in mind, or is it just natural to you?
Not general. I mean, it's probably natural to the extent that I've been writing poetry for a long time. It's been a big focus for, probably, how old am I? Probably at least 40 years or more. So yeah, it's always in my head how something sounds. I mean, I personally am of the belief that haiku should, I'm sort of the Basho school, that the haiku should feel like ordinary language.
Definitely.
That it's easy for someone to just speak a haiku. That it doesn't, it's not too convoluted. It doesn't use weird words to some extent. I mean, every rule is made to be broken, but just in general, ordinary language read in an ordinary voice.
I said at the beginning that this one elicited quite a number of comments, so I've got one last one for you. And there's one from Marion here, and she says that she found that there was a tension in this poem, and that effectively suggests an underlying narrative. So my question to you on this one would be, again, were you aware of setting the tension in the poem? Is that something you set out to do?
Not consciously, but something about, I mean, I'm sure, I don't remember exactly, but I'm sure the poem arose because I was sitting here at my desk, which has a window facing the backyard and the river, and the crows go back and forth all the time. So I'm sure I was sitting here at my desk working on something for a good part of a day and just noticing the crows going back and forth on a foggy day here on the Maine coast. And something about that, I think, intuitively strikes me. I mean, to make it poem worthy, it has to have something, if not a specific tension, some point of interest that, I don't know, I feel would appeal to someone reading it. So yes, not a conscious thing, but something about watching the crows going back and forth on a gloomy, foggy day.
Indeed, there's a lot of gray and dark colors in that image. Maybe that's some of the tension.
Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, fog in itself, I mean, you can romanticize it, but when you experience it a lot, like we do, I think, it can be claustrophobic. It's hiding things. It creates mystery. I mean, it does contribute to tension in a scene, unless you can take it both ways. You could make it romantic and dreamy, but it can also be, obscuring, hiding, mysterious, claustrophobic.
Yeah. Next one I wanted to talk about, and this is, as you read it, I thought, oh, here we are again. Last time you were on the podcast, I don't know if you remember, you read us a poem about, as you said, a buoy, I think. And I said, in English, we call it a boy. We've got another one of those. So let me read it English wise and see what you think. My long sweater, the color of forsythia, winter rain. See, another one. But this is one of my favorites from the book. And I think when we started out to put this together, I wrote to you and said, oh, I'm sitting here and it's really miserable. I've got that winter rain. And I really wish I had a sweater or a jumper, as I would say, the colour of forsythia. I don't. And I went out, Kristen, I have to tell you, I went out shopping for this sweater.
I should have worn it for
You
this.
should have done, actually. We should
Yeah.
have coordinated. But anyway, I went looking for this jumper. And I have to tell you, the colour of forsythia does not suit me. I did not buy it. So I'm going with pink instead. That'll have to cheer me up. But on a serious side, I love this one. I love the use of the colour, because I think for me the yellow really made a huge difference to the emotions between the fragment and the phrase in this. And I thought that was a brilliant use of colour.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Next one, sap moon. Now, I'm always intrigued by the mention of the moon. Let me read this one again. Sap moon, stepping in moose tracks to stay on the trail. I can really hear Maine. I imagine that you have moose, whereas we don't have moose here, so I was a bit lost. But I'm intrigued by the mention of the moon, because often I think that people stick a reference to the moon in, and it can sound quite glib. But I've read a few of yours, and it always strikes me that you know what you're talking about when you're using a moon image. So can you remember why you used sap moon in this particular instance?
Well, one, it was seasonally accurate to the moment. And two, moose tracks are big and round, and they're kind of moony. They're like two big crescents together. So I don't know. I mean, that's a stretch, but I'm sure imagistically, I was thinking visually of a moose track. And
oh, that didn't hit me at all. I just thought, because the sap moon, I think, indicates the start of spring, or that that spring's on its way. And I think it's, in some other instances, you could possibly use a crow moon for the same idea, which would be right up your street, because I know you're rather fond of crows. But to me, wouldn't have worked anyway near as good as sap moon for this one.
Well, and sap moon, oops, sorry.
I was going to say, just in case people don't know what sap moon is, when I looked it up, because I'm not really good at with moon references, I'm trying to improve. It, as I say, it heralds the start of spring, but it's about when people can start tapping the maple for the sap and make the syrup. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, well, I was going to say sap moon also, I mean, for me, it evokes a very specific time of year. It's, yes, when people start to get the sap buckets up on the maple trees. But here in New England, it's still very much winter. I mean, we often get our worst snowstorms in March, and that's when people are tapping their trees. So it's sort of, it's one of those combination, like a transitional season. It's still winter here, but also there's that hint that spring is on the way, because the trees are feeling it. So being out on a trail, there's still quite a bit of snow on the trail, and you were asking me about this before we talked here, that I'm literally stepping in the moose tracks because there's so much snow on the trail, that I want to step in the packed down part where the moose have been. And the moose are on the trail because it's easier for them to walk on a trail than to just tromp through all the snow through the woods. So there's a lot of things coming in together. So I'm thinking of like the little bit of hope that there's sap in these trees that are still quite bare and leafless and don't look like they're going to wake up anytime soon. And there's snow on the ground and things are dripping and sap is drippy, and then you've got a moose tromping through the snow and trying to follow the moose footsteps. And so we're both following the same trail, hoping that it will be spring soon, I'm sure.
Yes. I mean, that's what I took from it, because obviously I don't have moose here, but in the same instance, I hope by now, by the sort of March time, the snow will have gone. There's none out there at the moment, even though we had it overnight. And so I suppose early February would be the time where, if we had moose, I'd be stepping in the footsteps. So when I go out, I'm always pleased when somebody's been out with their dog, and I can sort of, somebody with bigger feet than me, so usually a bloke, I suppose, and I'm tramping away, following the trail, just stepping in his footprints, because otherwise it's a nightmare. So I was with you on that one. So
Yeah.
thank you for that.
But then that's very much a main, for me, that's very much, or at least a northern New England poem.
Mhm.
Like, I think to fully understand the nuances of it, you need to have spent time in quote unquote spring in northern New England.
No offense, Kristen. I hate the snow. I'll come in autumn and see. Are the moose around then? I can.
Yeah, they're running in the autumn. Yeah, they're pretty active then. That's when they're mating. So
Oh, there you go. I'm coming in the autumn. See you next year. Departing ferry, tossed flowers drift back to shore. Again, this one had a lot of us thinking. When I said word choice, this is the poem I wanted to talk to you about, word choice, because Marion raised the issue about how did you know the flowers were tossed? But I might put it another way. How did you decide the flowers were tossed? Unless, of course, you actually saw them being thrown into the water.
well, an earlier version of this haiku was departing ferry, our tossed flowers drift back to shore. So this is one of those where the kigo it's a personal one. Like, no one else would know that this is in the fall, except for me and other people who have visited Monhegan Island. But this is a Monhegan Island poem. And when you leave Monhegan Island on the ferry, people who live there or are staying there will give you a little bouquet of flowers, and you have to toss it as the ferry is passing the wharf to ensure that you'll come back. It's an island ritual. And since I'm there for half of September every year, for me, this is a September poem, but no one else would know that.
Oh no, you see, I went in a totally different direction.
Yeah.
To me, I was stuck in the middle of an ocean, if you like,
Yeah.
or crossing the channel and throwing out the flowers to commemorate the death of somebody, you know, a memorial for that one.
Yep.
So that's a much nicer idea. Right, you've just said that this one's got a personal kigo, that it means autumn to you. It's not obvious necessarily that it's a kigo. So somebody else might pick up on that. Would you say this is haiku or senryu to your normal reader? And
so two responses to this. One, I think senryu can have kigo. And that's a whole conversation in itself.
Oh yeah.
And I will just say just briefly that Brian Rickert, who's one of the editors of Failed Haiku, just accepted some of my poems. I won't say haiku or senryu because he was teasing me when he accepted them that he was going to catch it from the other editors because they were the most haiku-like senryu he'd ever read with seasoned words. So, but he agrees with me that some senryu can have seasoned words, that doesn't disqualify them. Part two, I think haiku and senryu are on a spectrum, and there's haiku, there's senryu, but there's a huge gray area in between. And I was at a haiku presentation once where about that very thing, and at the end of the presentation, just talking about senryu and what we all think it is, et cetera, et cetera. I don't even remember who the poet was, but the poet did a reading of haiku and senryu and asked us after each poem, is this haiku or senryu? And we all had to raise our hands. And some of them, we all agreed this was definitely a haiku, this was definitely senryu. But I don't know, half or more of the poems he read, half the people thought it was and half the people thought it wasn't. So there's a huge gray area of overlap where it's just not particularly obvious. And I don't sit down and say, I'm going to write a senryu or I'm going to write a haiku. I just write it. And then however it turns out, I only think about it if I'm submitting it somewhere. So for example, with Failed Haiku, they're accepting senryu.
Yeah.
I tried to pull together my most senryu like poems that I could for Brian, and yeah.
Yeah, it is a very, as you say, there is a huge spectrum of haiku senryu, and it's a topic that I'll be going into, quite possibly with Brian, to try and discuss. But so we won't do that here. Right, next one then. Longest day, I watched the tide come all the way in. Now, having said how much I enjoyed the spoken word, I think this is one that people really need to go and have a look at on the page too. And I can't really do it justice just talking about it, but just to say that lines 2 and 3 are inset from the first one, each a little bit further over. And for me, this just adds to the poem. I mean, it's lovely when you hear it, and the way you read it, it's got that gentle rhythm again, so you could sort of hear the tidal noise. But when you see it on the page, to me, it adds to the atmosphere because it looks a bit like the waves coming all the way in. And again, is this a device you really thought about? Because it's the only one that we're talking about today, certainly, that has a different format.
Yes. Yeah, I very rarely do that, mess around with the lines unless it just feels right. But generally I don't mix up my line spacing very much. I'm very much the left flush kind of poet. And I couldn't remember when you asked me about this before, and I was thinking about it. It was definitely an intentional thing, and I was definitely trying to mirror, the water. I think that may have come out. I workshop one-on-one quite a bit with Brad Bennett. And I think that may have come out of a conversation with Brad over that particular poem. Because he's really good at making suggestions like that. Like, oh, if you just did this, it would add this whole new level. And so I think I owe that to Brad.
We all need a Brad in our lives, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Have to share him around. Yeah, actually, that's another good point, that if you do have someone that you can share ideas with, just toss them back and forward. You often find some little spark happens like that, and it's really valuable. Okay, so people should definitely go and have a look. I haven't already made that point already. Go and have a look. Next one I wanted to talk about was March Wind, the blue tarp flaps loose on the woodpile. Now, interestingly, when you read this, you read it March Wind, a blue tarp flaps loose on the woodpile.
Is it the in the book?
I think I got it from the book, but anyway, don't worry about it. It's
I gotta look. It is the
okay. I mean, I don't know whether that makes we'll have that would be another podcast to really look and see whether it should be there or
I think it may have been at one point at
originally,
one time.
yeah.
I think John might have edited that one to the and he, because I know he did an edit. He did a couple small edits to that particular poem. It has appeared in a few different forms, and the final form is thanks to John. And I guess I'm still hung up on the old way. I don't know.
I won't worry about it. I won't tell him. But this one again, another haiku with color in it. And I think the blue really jumped out for me and brought the whole thing to life. Again, your March Wind on the wood part and the blue tarp on the wood part, again, felt very wintry and bitterly cold to me. And the blue just, again, cheered it all up and made it beautiful again. But interestingly, Steve had an interesting reaction to this poem. And he said, "You don't mention snow, but in my senses, I saw snow and felt the cold, bitter wind." And he was born in Wisconsin, which you will know better than me. I haven't got a clue really, but I imagine that's quite northerly. And so this brought back his memories of the cold, wintry marches, I guess, of Wisconsin. Did you have snow in mind when you were writing it?
I think that I did. because as I said, there's generally some remnant of snow still in March. And just, if you say blue tarp to me, just out of the blue, no pun intended, I think of a blue tarp and I picture snow on it.
Oh, okay.
Just which I don't know why. So yes, I'm sure there was some remnant of snow or ice involved on that tarp. And for some reason, tarps seem to be blue around here. But I love that it was blue because I was thinking of, that March sky and how sometimes it can look
Yeah.
so beautiful and spring-like, even when there's still snow on the ground and you're still freezing in the wind and
Yeah.
things.
We had a day like that here today. Beautiful. It snowed overnight, but the sky was a beautiful blue with those heavy sort of snow clouds coming in as well. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about. But what the point I wanted to make about that as well is, it's really interesting when you hear a comment back from somebody like Steve, because it just shows how your reader finishes the poem off.
Mhm.
They're rather important to the whole circle of a poem. So thank you, Steve, and everybody else who wrote to us and gave us some opinions and thoughts on the poems. And I think I would really love it if you could finish off with one more reading of North Star, which just leaves me speechless.
Thank you. Yeah. And I mean, it made sense. I think my original manuscript had this at the end and it made sense. John wanted to keep it at the end, I think, because it made sense. Sort of he arranged everything seasonally in the chapbook, and sort of emphasizing the cycle of the seasons sort of at the end with that is one of the aspects of the image of that poem. So I will end with the poem. North Star, it always comes back to this.
It's beautiful. And that's a
Thank
great place to stop.
you.
Oh, thanks, Kristen. It's been a pleasure and an inspiration, as it always is, talking to you. Thank you
You.
very much.